Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight to our 9th stay-at-home lecture sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions. And I want to thank you all for joining me here tonight. I'm Tim Nutt, the Director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS. And we are, as you probably know by now, we are the Archives Department of the UAMS Library. We're the only archives in the state that's specifically dedicated to the collection and preservation of health sciences history in Arkansas. We were established in 1978. And we're home to artifacts of all sorts, as well as rare books, photographs, and archival collections. And we're always looking for additional materials. So if you have materials dealing with any aspect of the health sciences in Arkansas, I'd love to talk with you. We'd love to preserve those materials, especially materials that document these times that we're living in now, the pandemic times, as we're calling it. So anything that journals, if you're keeping a journal, if you're keeping a diary, if you're taking photographs during this time of how you and your family are getting through this, flyers, we're looking for flyers telling you to stay 6 feet back or wash your hands or anything like that. We're interested in that. And of course, masks as well. If you're finished with your masks and they've been washed, we'd love to preserve some of the unusual masks that you've used during these times. As I mentioned, tonight's sponsor is the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the Friends Group for the Historical Research Center. And if you're not a member of the Society, I hope you will consider joining. The dues are inexpensive, $5 for a student membership, $15 for an individual membership. The link is on the page. If you want to skip that long URL, you can just go directly to PayPal, paypal.me/SHMHP, and you can just pay your dues directly from there. And if you pay them now, it'll take you all the way through the end of 2021. So you'll actually be getting a deal. You'll get almost a year and a half for an individual membership, or what you would usually pay for an individual membership. So a few notes: if you joined these before, you've heard these notes before. Everyone is on mute right now, and everyone will remain on mute for the entirety of the presentation. And I have also, your video is not on also. If everything goes like it should and works properly, you should be able to ask questions in the chat box at the end of the presentation, but you don't have to wait until the end to type a question in the chat box. Feel free to go ahead and use that chat feature, and I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Now, before we jump into the presentation tonight, I'd like to highlight a couple of the Society's board members. We have a board of 14, and all dedicated to the support of the Society. Dr. Frank Tebow on the left side of the screen is a mostly retired OBGYN in Benton. He's been on our Society board for a number of years, and we really appreciate everything that he's done to help the Society fulfill its mission and the Historical Research Center. And on your right is Dr. Micah Hester, who is the chair of the Department of Medical Humanities and Bioethics, and also professor of Medical Humanities and Pediatrics at UAMS. Dr. Hester is fairly new to the board. He was elected in 2018, and he's done much to improve our programming. He's been very supportive of our programming and has had a lot of good ideas. So thanks to Dr. Hester and to Dr. Tebow for their continuing support of the Society. Now you'll see on your screen, we have 2 more presentations coming up 2 more presentations in September. September 3rd, History of Midwifery in Arkansas by Jared Phillips, who's at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And then I and Dr. Jim Mark Ingram will be giving a presentation on September 17th on home medical recipes. The board just voted the other day, and you'll see it on your screen, beginning in October, we will only be having one of these events a month, and they're going to be on the first Thursday of each month. So that is going to be October, I don't have that on my notes, but the first Thursday in October is going to be the next stay at home, beginning the once a month in October. The Zoom meeting space, you'll see the link at the bottom of your screen. That's the same link that you've used all these other times to sign on, so you can continue to use that link for the ones in September and the ones in October and further out. Now, I'm pleased to welcome tonight our speakers. Mary Ryan, who is, I lost a page of my notes, so I'm going to have to read off the cover of the book. Mary Ryan worked in health sciences libraries at Tulane University and the Texas Medical Center, and was director of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, UAMS library, for 17 years. We also have William Russell here with us tonight. And he is a retired colonel in the U.S. Army and media relations specialist who is actually descended from the Russell physicians, who you'll hear about tonight. And then finally, we have William Lindsey, who is a former university administrator and the winner of the Booker Worthen Literary Prize for Fiat Flux, The Writings of Wilson R. Batchelor, 19th century country doctor and philosopher. And so they're going to be talking about their new book, A Family Practice, The Russell Doctors and the Evolving Business of Medicine. Now tonight, the authors have been very gracious, and they have generously donated a copy of the book for a door prize tonight. So we'll be drawing for that at the end of the presentation. Don't worry, you're not going to have to pick it up. We will mail it to you, and it will, I've been told it will be signed by all 3 authors. So good luck to everyone on that. But if you don't get that copy tonight, I encourage you to go to the University of Arkansas Press. They're selling the book at a discounted price right now. So I encourage you to do that. So I am going to turn on Mary Ryan's video. This is the first time that we've had 3 different presenters, so you'll have to excuse me if it goes a little astray tonight. There she is. So I am going to turn off my video. Let me unmute her. Mary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I'm going to turn off my video. I'm going to mute myself, but I'm going to be in charge of advancing the slides. So Mary, Bill, and Bill, don't forget to remind me to advance the slides for you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. We're happy to be here tonight. We appreciate your inviting us to talk about our new book, Family Practice. Next slide, please. There are 3 major themes of the book. One is the evolution of medical education and healthcare as seen through the lives of these 6 physicians, especially in the 1800s and even well into the 1900s. There were a lot of changes in medical education and healthcare, and we discuss those when we're describing the lives of the 6 physicians. The second theme is the business of medicine, because especially in the 1800s, it was very hard for physicians to make a living just practicing medicine. So the Russell doctors, like many others, had other businesses on the side through which they helped support their families. And then the third theme of the book is the effects of the physicians' practices on their family life, because especially with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th physicians, they were involved in a traveling medical practice, and they were often away from home for sometimes months at a time, and they left behind their wives and a bunch of little kids and sometimes a farm to take care of and other things. So their traveling practice had a big effect on their family lives. And there were a lot of very strong women in the Russell family. Next slide, please. There are 6 doctors in the Russell family that we talk about in the book. The first one is the patriarch of the family. That was William James Russell. He had several sons, and one of them was William James Park Russell, whom we also know as WJP Russell. He had several sons. 2 of them became physicians, Sebern and Ralph. And then Sebern and Ralph have a nephew, Benjamin Franklin Norwood, who was their sister Ava's son. And then George Washington Russell was the 15th child of Sebern Russell. So he and Ben were first cousins, but they were a generation apart because George was so late in Sebern's life. So next slide, please. William Lindsey is going to talk first about William James Russell.
I think I've pushed all the buttons.
You're good, Bill. You're good.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem.
I'm not skilled at this, and I echo Mary's thanks to the Society for History of Medicine for sponsoring this event this evening. As Mary said, I'm going to talk about the founding member of the Russell family dynasty of doctors, William James Russell. He was born August 24, 1799 in Cabarrus County, North Carolina, to William and Sarah McCree Russell. His father died 6 months before William was born. Russell's biographer, John Livingston, in the book Portrait of Eminent Americans Now Living, would speak in 1854 of the dark adversities of fortune that William had overcome in his life, evidently referring to his early loss of his father and the difficulties his being orphaned created for him. The Russells and McCrees were part of a large migration of Scots-Irish Presbyterian families who had arrived in Pennsylvania from Ireland in the first part of the 18th century, then moved to Western, North, and South Carolina before the Revolution. When he was 4, his mother, Sarah, remarried to another member of this group, John Alexander, and the family moved down to Spartanburg County, South Carolina, where William grew up and got his first medical training from Dr. Andrew Barry Moore. If you could advance a slide, please, Tim. Like most doctors in the 18th and even the 19th century, William learned medicine by the preceptorship method, a form of apprenticeship in which an aspiring doctor read medicine with a practicing one, assisting him in his practice and receiving his instruction. I'm using the male pronoun here deliberately because doctors of this period were almost exclusively males. Andrew Barry Moore had studied at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania and then trained under the distinguished early American doctor Benjamin Rush. Having studied with Moore, Russell then returned to Cabarrus County, North Carolina, and apprenticed himself to Dr. Charles Harris, who had also studied with Rush after graduating from University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. Through his 2 mentors, Moore and Harris, Russell was strongly influenced by Benjamin Rush's view of medical practice, which emphasized a pragmatic approach to healing in which doctors should be willing to learn from nurses, midwives, and Native American healing techniques. Having completed his medical training, William James Russell then headed to Georgia, a state that had been flooded with new settlers following the Revolution, many of them hoping to make fortunes quickly growing cotton with enslaved labor. It should be noted that doctors of this period and later as well combined their medical work, at which they often made little money, with other business enterprises, including farming, a point that Mary mentioned already. William would supplement his medical income by running a plantation that grew cotton with enslaved labor and speculating in cotton mills, and we think also the railroad system. The search for ways to bring in additional income as they practiced medicine would be a distinguishing feature of the dynasty of Russell family doctors. If you could advance the slide, please, Tim. After settling in Georgia just before 1820, William established a practice in the newly founded county seat of Gwinnett County, Lawrenceville, Georgia, some 30 miles east of Atlanta. And in 1825, he married his first wife, Sophia Park. His mother and stepfather joined him in Lawrenceville, and the Russell and Alexander families played a leading role in the formation of the town's Presbyterian Church, Fairview. As his practice developed, a number of young men apprenticed themselves to William James Russell and learned medicine from him. Two of these, Jesse Lowe and James M. Gordon, went on to study at the Medical College of Georgia. Gordon was a partner in Russell's practice in Lawrenceville and mentions Russell in articles he published regarding his cases. The 1850 graduation notice of William's son, William James Park Russell, at Philadelphia College of Medicine states that his father had been his preceptor before he entered the Philadelphia school. From Charles Harris, William James Russell had learned the art of surgery, which was Harris's specialty, and he taught that art to his son, W.J.P., who, as Mary also noted, had a traveling medical practice. W.J.P. taught his sons, Seaburn and Ralph, as he toured the southern states, doing corrective surgeries for crossed eyes, cleft lip, clubfoot, and so forth. Ralph would go on to study medicine formally at Bellevue Medical School in New York City and King's College in London. In Seaburn's case, his father's preceptorship constituted his entire medical education. As this history indicates, the preceptorial method of medical education continued right down the line up to the start of the 20th century in much of the United States. For early Arkansas doctors, it was almost exclusively the method of learning medicine. William James Russell's wife, Sophia, died in 1844, and the following year he married his second wife, Iantha Messenia Huff, by whom he had a second family of children. William died at Lawrenceville on October 7, 1872, and is buried there in the cemetery of the Fairview Presbyterian Church, in which his family had played a leading formative role. And now I'll turn the screen over. I'm sorry, there was a slide of Lawrenceville, Georgia, and I forgot to mention that to you, Tim. I'll turn the microphone over to Bill.
Hello, hope everybody can hear me. Thank you, Bill. The slide that Bill has up on the screen shows where Dr. William James Russell lived in Lawrenceville. The house that he lived in is the house with the double fireplace over to the left of your screen. It's kind of got an angled roof, and it was one of the oldest ones there, and finally burned down in about 1980, I think, late. Slide, please, Tim. We'll talk about William James Park Russell a little bit, try to make it quick. I apologize for rushing fast, but we're limited for time. He was born in Lawrenceville, Georgia. When he was 14 years old, his mother died, as Bill indicated earlier. And when he was 17, he joined the Army with his father's permission, and he joined the Army for the war with Mexico. And he served 6 months as an infantry private in the war with Mexico, but was stationed the entire time at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. And in July of 1848, he was released from active duty and returned back to Lawrenceville. Slide, please, Tim. In the fall of 1848, he entered medical school at the Medical College of Georgia, located in Augusta, Georgia. And he was a medical student for 2 years. And in March of 1850, he and 3 other students in his class were rejected for their final examinations. We do not know why. There's not a lot of evidence indicating the nature of the rejection. We're told it could have been for a lot of different reasons. But nonetheless, he ends up going to the Philadelphia College of Medicine in March of 1850, and he graduates there in July of 1850. He returns to Georgia, and in the fall, he marries a lady from a fairly wealthy family in Gainesville, Georgia, and begins his practice in November or December of 1850. And he spends the next 10 years practicing medicine in Gainesville and in several other communities in North and Northwest Georgia, with a specialty on clubfoot surgery, eye surgery, and cleft lip surgery. Slide, please, Tim. Here is an advertisement that appeared in the Athens, Georgia newspaper. In this particular case, it was in the Tuskegee, Alabama paper, but it was an ad that he used a lot to promote the various maladies that he said that he could treat. We know that by 1860, he was having some financial difficulties, and he suddenly pulls uproot from Northwest Georgia and moves west to Texas. And he ends up in June of 1860 at a place called Bosqueville, Texas, which is right outside of Waco. He's not practicing medicine that we know, but he's with a family who is a big cotton producer from Georgia, also from Georgia. Then we lose track of him until the spring of 1862, and he shows up with 5 or 6 children that he's had by this time in northwest Mississippi, and in Corinth, Mississippi to be exact. And he's working as a cotton buyer for the Maurice Cotton Company out of St. Louis. Then, strangely enough, he gets hired by Union General Henry Halleck of the Union Army, which is occupying Corinth as a result of the Battle of Corinth, as a detective, doing detective work. And for the next year to 14 months, he uses his medical credentials as a cover to do detective and espionage work for the Union Army, specifically working for William S. Rosecrans, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, headquartered out of Nashville, his deputy, Major General David S. Stanley, and also Brigadier General, later to be President, James A. Garfield. By the fall of 1863, the detective and espionage business became so dangerous for him, and he feared for his life, that he went west. He left Tennessee and worked 2 years as a cotton farmer in Jonesboro, Illinois, and raising cotton. Then in the spring of 1866, for some reason, he goes to Louisiana, and he is for a short time in Alexandria. Then he's in Shreveport, where he loses one of his children. And then in the fall, about September of 1866, he settles in Evansville, Arkansas, which is a small community in Washington County, Arkansas, right along the Indian Territory, Arkansas border. And for the next 17 years, he practices medicine out of Washington County, traveling across the state and other states, doing his practice. And also, to supplement it, he works as a livestock broker, purchasing and selling mules and ponies. Slide, please, Tim. In 1885, moves to Dallas, Texas, and starts practicing medicine. This is one of his business cards from 1887. You'll note the addition of his 2 sons, Sebring and Ralph, at that time. And he travels out of Dallas into southern Texas, into Louisiana and Mississippi, notably, doing these types of surgeries and offering his services. Dr. Russell passed away at the relatively young age of 61 in Wills Point, Texas, right outside of Dallas, in January of 1892. Slide, please, Tim. This is the wild child of the Russell bunch, Sebring Rance Russell. This picture was taken in 1878 when he was about 18 years of age, taken at Fayetteville, Arkansas, in the studio. Sebring had a very tempestuous, dramatic life. He had 3 wives, 16 known children, and he abandoned 6 of them at one time. By all other accounts, medically, it appears that he was a pretty solid practitioner. But slide, please, Tim. He was raised in Northwest Arkansas, educated at the Cane Hill College, which is in Cane Hill, right outside of Fayetteville, a prominent school at that time. And then in the early 1880s, he started traveling with his father initially as a drummer. That is to say, they go into a community and he would try to drum up business for his father's practice. By the mid-1880s, he decided he'd like to study medicine a little more seriously and surgery. And January of 1887 is the first time we note in newspaper articles and documents that he's referred to as Dr. Sebring Russell. He abandons his first wife in 1890, left her with 6 children, and moved to Greene County, Arkansas, where he took up with another woman. We don't know for sure if he married her, but he had 4 children by her. We hadn't been able to find a marriage record. They had 4 children, but he practiced for about 7 years in Walcott, Paragould, Laredo, and also Jonesboro. In 1897, he moved to Beebe, which is in White County, and practiced medicine for a time there, general medicine, we believe, more than anything else. And in May of 1900, his wife suddenly dies from a virulent form of influenza, which raged across Arkansas during that particular year. He leaves there, moves to Perry County, Arkansas, where he practices medicine for 3 years in Perry County, in Houston, Arkansas, and in Perryville. In Houston, we think he was working with what was a railroad type of hospital at that time in Houston. He returns to Little Rock in 1904, spends the last 24 years of practicing in Little Rock, and we were very blessed to have found 2 of his diaries from 1920 and 21. Wish we had time to go into a lot of the examples. He has all of his patients in there. He goes into all of the treatments that he did, the cost, $2 to $4 for a home visit, $2 to $3 for an office visit, $2 more for any prescriptions that he might have offered. He notes in 1920 the real explosion of drug addiction, which was quite prominent in that area. He treated a lot of cases for drug addiction. Slide, please, Tim. This is a photograph of Sebring on the right with his brother on the left, as you see the photo. And in his office, his medical office on 7th Street in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was my great-grandfather. I did not know him. I did know his eldest daughter, my great-aunt Maud, and she told 4 quick stories about him to me when I was a young man in my 20s. I wish I'd paid more attention to her. She noted that she'd had some heart ailments, and he told her at a young age that she needed to take a little strychnine in order to take care of that heart ailment. He also told her that her teeth was the absolute secret to having a good heart. He did not like to have men wearing a belt. He always thought men's digestive health and their stomach muscles would be better treated by wearing suspenders, and he thought that cucumbers were toxic. I don't know if they really are, but I know I'm not a particular fan of them myself. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Mary to talk about his brother Ralph.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, so if Sebring was the wild child of the Russell family, Ralph was the enigma. He was an interesting character, and I'll talk more about him. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, Ralph was Sebring's younger brother. He too attended Cane Hill College, the same place that Sebring went to school. It was near Fayetteville, and when the university was established in Fayetteville, and Cane Hill College just faded away. Ralph and Sebring were both mentored by their father. When they were young, maybe 10 to 12, they started traveling with their father, WJP, on his surgical trips. And as I mentioned before, sometimes he was gone for months at a time. He would take the boys with him. They would go into different towns and try to drum up business for their father. And as they grew a little bit older, they began assisting their father with his surgeries. And so that was the first way that they both started studying medicine. Now, Ralph decided that he needed to have a formal medical education. And so he enrolled at Bellevue Medical College in New York City in the fall of 1885. And at that time, the curriculum for Bellevue was you would go to medical school for a 5 to 6 month semester. And then for the rest of that year, you would go out and work with 1 or more physicians, learning basically by the preceptorial method. And then you would come back to New York City the next year and be there for another 5 to 6 month semester, and then you would graduate. Now, Ralph went to the first semester, and then he was working for his father in Texas, and then he went over to Alabama, and he ended up marrying his first cousin, who was from Gadsden. And so he did not return until the next year, when he graduated from Bellevue in the spring of 1888. And he was in a bad train wreck the day before graduation, and he received a $20,000 settlement from the railroad. So we think this is how he managed to establish his practice in Birmingham. Several years later, he went to King's College in London for 5 to 6 weeks to attend lectures there one summer. And then he went on over to the European continent and visited some major hospitals in Paris and in other parts of Europe. Next slide, please. Electricity was a relatively new discovery in 1891, and so a lot of people were experimenting with ways to use electricity, including people in the medical field. And so Ralph invented an instrument called the electrozone, which supposedly would help spread medicine throughout the body, and it could be used to help treat several different types of diseases. This was not an uncommon device. It was similar to other ones that were being developed at the time. Next slide, please. By 1896, Ralph was well established in Birmingham, and he introduced what he called the Dr. Ralph M. Russell Medico-Surgical Institute. And we have the address for the Institute, and but despite all of our efforts to find a photograph of the building, we never found a single one. But we did find a photograph of Ralph standing in front of a building with a facade that looked like this drawing of the Institute. It had a car dealership on the first floor, so we suspect that Ralph just rented some offices on the upper floor of this building. Next slide, please. Also in 1896, Ralph introduced what he called Vibini, which was the great liquid food, and he said it would cure a lot of different ailments. He applied for a trademark to protect the name Vibini, but he did not apply for a patent. If he had, he would have been required to reveal the formula for Vibini, but since he only got a trademark for it, we don't know what was in Vibini. Next slide, please. The next year, in 1897, Ralph applied for and received a patent for a little device that he called the reflector for focusing cathode rays. X-rays were relatively new at this time, and Ralph invented this little device that could be used in conjunction with an X-ray to make the X-rays more clear. Next slide, please. Beginning in 1900, Ralph introduced his handbook of home medicine. And in the 1800s, self-help books were really common, especially on the frontier, where people didn't have a lot of access to physicians and healthcare. They pretty much had to learn to take care of themselves. And so self-help books were very common, especially in the rural and frontier parts of the country in the 1800s. The Handbook of Home Medicine was very comprehensive. It was about 500 pages long. It had a large section that talked about each of the major diseases and conditions and what was known about them at the time. It included anatomical information and information about different drugs. It had recipes for herbal remedies. It had patterns for braces to treat orthopedic conditions. So it was a very comprehensive book, and it was published every year from 1900 to 1911. We've located several different editions of this book, and one of them has been donated to the Historical Research Center in the UAMS library. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Tim. The anatomical illustrations in this book were amazing. This was a really well printed book. I mean, the publisher did a really good job of printing it. The illustrations are just beautiful. This is what's called a mannequin, and you lift one layer of it, and then you can see what's underneath that layer, and then you lift another one and you can see what's underneath that. So there were several of these in the book in color, and there was one of the skeleton, the musculoskeletal system, and there was one of a man, and then later one of a woman. And so it was a very well illustrated book. Next slide, please. In the 1906 edition of the book, Ralph introduced what he called the Dr. Russell Mutual Medical Association. So if you paid $65 for a copy of the Handbook of Home Medicine, you became a member of the Mutual Medical Association, and you were entitled to contact Dr. Russell and get free medical advice from him. So the book came with symptom blanks, and you could fill in your symptoms. You could mail that form into Dr. Russell, and he would diagnose what was wrong with you and prescribe a treatment. And so what the patients paid for was the treatment that they received in the form of Vibini or some other tonic or something else that Dr. Russell would send by return mail to the patients. So that was the way that he actually made even more money out of the book, was to promote this mail order diagnosis and treatment system. Next slide, please. In the last edition of the book in 1911, Ralph introduced the National Home Nurses Training School, and it was incorporated in Birmingham. And for a fee, you could enroll as a student in this training school. You did lessons. It was like a correspondence course. You were sent materials, you filled out the lessons, you sent them in, and then at the end of about 17 months, if you passed the final exam, you would receive a certificate saying that you were a graduate of the National Home Nurses Training School, and that you were qualified not only to, to treat patients in your house, but you could be hired out to treat patients for other people, to take care of them. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we started looking at Ralph's career, and we started doing a lot of research into the healthcare system at the time in the United States, one of the things that we discovered was that in the 1800s, there was very little regulation of the practice of medicine, and most physicians did not have a degree. There weren't a lot of medical schools in the United States in the mid-1800s. And in 1842, only 4 states in the United States regulated the practice of medicine in any way. It was New York, New Jersey, Louisiana, and Georgia. And so the practice of medicine was pretty chaotic at that time. Anybody could hang up a shingle and say they were a physician and start treating patients, even if they had never had any training whatsoever. So, and they were developing a lot of devices and promoting those, that many of which were not effective in any way. There were a lot of charlatans and quacks out there promoting things that they knew were not effective in helping patients. So by 1900, there were a lot more medical schools in the US and a lot more physicians who had been trained in the practice of medicine. And so they were concerned about all the quackery that they saw going on in the United States. So they worked with the AMA, and the AMA began publishing articles in Collier's Weekly, which was a popular publication in the US at that time. And they were these articles would warn the public about different things like bogus medical institutes, getting medical treatment through the mail, different medical devices that they knew were not effective, and things like that. And so by 1912, the AMA consolidated those articles and a lot of other information into a publication called Nostrums and Quackery. This was the best resource we found on quackery. And it was also mentioned 2 weeks ago in Tom Dillard's stay-at-home lecture as well. And so the AMA began working with the Postal Service to prosecute people that they thought were quacks, that were deliberately defrauding. Not defrauding, they were deliberately misleading the public. And so the book, Nostrums and Quackery, was divided into several parts, and one looked at bogus medical institutes. And when they described them, it sounded a lot like what Ralph was doing with the Russell Medical Institute. He was doing mail order diagnosis and treatment, which was another topic that they wrote about extensively in this publication. They addressed medical devices like the electrozone that Ralph had invented. They didn't mention it specifically, but they talked about a lot of different ones that sounded a lot like his. And they had a big section on patent medicines and nostrums, like by Beanie. And they also talked about advertising, because a lot of the early advertising in the newspapers in the United States was medical advertising, and the AMA looked down on advertising medical services and devices and medicines, because they thought a lot of it was false advertising. And so next slide, please. So this is one of Ralph's articles, one of his ads, actually, announcing that he would be at the Washington Hotel in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This was in 1898, and it says, "He is coming, Dr. Ralph M. Russell, the eminent London and New York specialist." Well, he had only been in London 5 to 6 weeks, and we tracked his movements pretty well, so we're sure he was only in London 5 to 6 weeks attending classes at King's College. And he was only in New York during the 2 semesters that he attended Bellevue Medical School. So we think this was a little over the top for Ralph. So when we look at Ralph's career, like I said, we thought he was kind of an enigma. We think he was probably a relatively good surgeon. He was well educated, and if he had as much talent as his father seemed to have, then he was probably a good surgeon. But when we look at the quackery angle, we also think he overrepresented some of the things that he did and said. So he really was an enigma to us. We would love to talk to him about this. Next slide, please. So I don't have time to talk much about Ben and George, the last 2 physicians in the Russell family, but we did want to just say a few things about them. As we said, Ben was Ralph and Seburn's nephew. He went to medical school in Memphis and then joined the Navy and had a distinguished career in the Navy. And one of the things that we wanted to mention about him was that he is the only Russell physician in these 6 that we could find who had actually published articles in the medical literature. He had 3 articles published in the Naval Medical Bulletin, and he went on to have a distinguished career in the Navy. He practiced his the whole rest of his career in the Navy. And by this time, it was possible for physicians to make a living just practicing medicine without having to have other businesses on the side, unlike some of the earlier Russell doctors who had to have other businesses on the side. And then George Russell was the 15th child of Seaburn Russell. He was born and raised in Little Rock and graduated from UAMS in 1941. He was a naval surgeon in the Pacific during World War II, working on a ship, taking care of wounded soldiers during the day and then burying the dead ones at sea at night. And he went on to marry a girl from Little Rock and stayed in the Navy for a while after he came back from his tour of duty in the South Pacific. He was trained by the Navy to be a psychiatrist because they anticipated that there would be a lot of soldiers returning from the war with what we now know as PTSD. So he was sent to Philadelphia to train to be a psychiatrist. And after he was discharged from the Navy for injuries he received while evacuating patients from a Navy hospital fire, he established a mental health center outside of Philadelphia, and that's where he spent the rest of his career. He was a really interesting character. He had a lot of little businesses on the side, even though, by then physicians could make a living just being a physician. But he had some interesting businesses on the side, some of which were quite lucrative. So we talk about those in the book as well. Next slide. So in conclusion, the book, A Family Practice, covers 200 years of of the development of medical education and healthcare during a time period when medicine changed in ways that William James Russell could never have imagined. Next slide, please. We'd like to say a special thanks to the people in the Historical Research Center, Tim and April and Kaylee and Suzanne, who were a tremendous help to us while we were doing research on this book, and they gave us a lot of moral support too. And the other people in the UAMS library staff who were so helpful to us. Susan Stillman did a lot of the literature searches when we first started doing research for the book, and Cindy and Libby and Belinda helped us get materials from all over the country. And so, and Jan Hart was very supportive. So we really appreciate all the help that the UAMS library gave us.
If I may add also to Mike Beaker and his staff up at the U of A Press that were instrumental.
Right, they were very helpful too. And a lot of the books and materials that that we had, we were very lucky to have. Bill had been doing research on his family for 50 years, and we had scrapbooks. We had 150 letters from the 1800s and early 1900s that family members had written to each other. And this was how we really tracked a lot of the movements, which led us to a lot of other information about the Russell family. And so we were lucky to have a huge treasure trove of materials, which helped lead us to other sources of information too. So a lot of those have been donated to the Historical Research Center as well. So now I think we have some time for questions.
Okay, let me get Bill Lindsey's video on. Okay, let's see what questions we have. Thank y'all very much. That was very interesting. I really enjoyed hearing about the Russell family. Let's see. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box, and Mary and Bill will be happy to answer them. I have a question while we're waiting for questions to come in. On one of the slides where he talks about his mutual medical association, I noticed that it said Christian Medical Association at the bottom. Did he advertise that in other places, or was that the only instance, or was that a normal occurrence during that time period?
It probably was a relatively normal occurrence. We did not find that mentioned anywhere else, but we know that Ralph was a religious man, and we know that his wife was very religious and very active in the Methodist Church in Birmingham for 40 to 50 years. She served on a lot of committees and was on the mission board and all kinds of things. So we know that she was extremely religious. And we know from some things we found of his that he was religious as well, but we did not see the Russell Medical Institute or the Mutual Medical Association called a Christian thing anywhere except on that certificate.
What was, I'm curious, was there anything that y'all put in your research, either one of the three of you or all three of you, was there anything that particularly surprised you or shocked you that you found in the research?
Well,
Civil War.
the Civil War, yeah, as Mary said, was just an absolute shock for me. Bill can join in here, and I'd like to hear what he would say too, of course. But to discover that William James Park used his medical credentials, having been raised on a cotton plantation in deep Georgia, with the establishment, to turn and go to work for the Union Army, doing that kind of detective espionage work. I think that was pretty much a big shock for us. Although his George Russell had told me in the early 70s that his father Sebring said his first memory was going to WJP to Springfield, Illinois, to see Lincoln lying in state, and claimed that he was an admirer of Abraham Lincoln. but I did not know that that would translate to him going to work doing espionage work against the Confederacy. Bill, are you on? Do you have some thoughts?
I'm on. For me, the intriguing character was really Ralph. And as Mary said, he was an enigma. So often his medical practice and publications and inventions seem to be just this side of bona fide medicine, very close to the line that would distinguish quackery from medicine. In that regard, he wasn't different from a lot of doctors of his day, but if you read some of the exposés of quackery from that period, it's sort of like you're reading a description of much that Ralph himself was doing. So of all the doctors, I guess I would like to have Ralph around to talk to about what he thought he was doing, I guess. So.
Right.
Yeah, it would be a toss-up for me between Ralph and WJP, because WJP was such an interesting character. Why did he not get to graduate from the Medical College of Georgia and find out, a few days before graduation? How did he become a spy for the Union at the same time that his father was financially devastated in Georgia, and his brother was a POW up in Ohio? He was a Confederate soldier. And so WJP could not let anybody know that he was a Union spy, because if you were anywhere in the South, it was very dangerous if anybody found out that you were a sympathizer for the Union. So I'm sure nobody in his family knew, except perhaps his wife, because it was too dangerous for anybody else to know. So that was just such a stunning revelation for us that we were just blown away, because the family legend was that WJP ran a Confederate field hospital during the Civil War, and then we find out, no, he wasn't even practicing medicine then. He was working as a spy for the Union. And I should mention that being a spy for the Union was a lucrative thing to do during the Civil War. I mean, those spies, of course, it was very dangerous work, and they made a lot more money than a regular soldier did. So it was a lucrative business for him at the time, but he was the major witness in a trial against some cotton runners. And so after that, he had to, disappear. So it was interesting. When he came back from Illinois to Arkansas, he had to change his name a little bit so that hopefully he could keep a low profile and people wouldn't realize who he was.
We have one question that came in, or actually two now, about George. Do you know specifics about where in the South Pacific George served?
Yes, he was on the USS Pennsylvania, and that battleship worked in the Gilbert and Mariana Islands during World War II.
And then the other question is, do you know specifics about the train wreck?
We didn't find a whole lot about it. We found some newspaper articles about it, and it ran off the track.
Right.
Several cars ran off the track, and people were just tossed around like matchsticks, I guess. I mean, there were some fatalities and quite a few injuries from it. And Ralph's injury, they said, crippled him for life. But as far as we can tell in later pictures and stuff, he looks like, he's standing up just fine. We're not sure whether those injuries were life-threatening or long-lasting. We don't really know, but there were a lot of people injured in that wreck. It was in Skio, New York, and we have the name of the railroad company and the information about the settlement and things like that. It's amazing what you can find if you dig far enough.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank y'all very much. This was very interesting. And we're going to give away a copy of the book. And I appreciate y'all donating a copy of it. And I'm going to, since today's the 20th, I'm going to count down by video the 20th. So the 20th video that we have, the 20th person that came in is actually going to probably get the book. So I'm going to exclude the three of us because we were the first three.
Okay.
In.
We don't need any more copies.
So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Dr. David Davies is number 20.
Yay. Very good.
So Dr. Davies, congratulations. We will get that book to you. And I think it's going to be signed by all three authors, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank y'all again. Thank you, Mary and Bill. And Bill, thank you for this. It was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed it. And the book is great. I haven't finished it yet, but I've started it and I've really enjoyed it. And of course, I enjoyed working with y'all and on pulling the materials together. And we're just so thankful to have the materials in the Historical Research Center. Y'all have done a great job in pulling the history of this family together.
Well, thank you. We appreciate all the help that y'all gave us along the way and listening to us whine and complain.
Well, thank y'all. I will hope to see everybody first Thursday in September. We'll have on midwifery in Arkansas. And y'all have a good night. Stay safe, and we will talk to you soon.
All right.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for logging in.
Bye.
Bye.